She buried a husband, a farm, and the last version of herself she recognized, all before turning 30. Now, standing at the edge of a stranger's dying land with a cracked leather suitcase and a folded newspaper advertisement she'd read so many times the ink had smudged onto her palm, Margaret Hale had exactly two choices: turn around and disappear into a life that had already swallowed everything she loved, or walk through that gate toward a man who couldn't save his own cattle and a ranch everyone in 3 counties had already written off as dead. She walked through the gate. Drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with me to the very end. The advertisement had been folded inside a brown envelope that smelled like dust and old coffee, passed hand to hand through the post office in Harlan, Nebraska, before it finally landed on the counter of the dry goods store where Margaret worked Tuesday through Saturday. Stacking flour sacks and pretending she wasn't listening to other people's conversations about their futures. Mrs. Opal Finch, who ran the post office and also somehow knew everything that happened within 40 miles in every direction, had slipped the envelope across the counter without being asked. Came addressed to any woman of serious disposition willing to consider frontier work and marriage, Opal said, adjusting her spectacles. I thought of you immediately. Margaret had not found that comforting. She'd taken the envelope home to the narrow room she rented above the hardware store, sat on the edge of her cot, and read the advertisement 3 times before she let herself react to it. Seeking a capable woman, widow or single, aged 25 to 40, of practical mind and strong constitution. The work is real and hard. The ranch is struggling. I will not dress it up as anything other than what it is. If you require comfort before labor, do not write back. If you can see possibility in difficult ground, I would like to hear from you. C. Brennan, Dry Fork Ranch, Millhaven County, Montana. It was the strangest marriage advertisement she had ever read. Most of them, the ones she'd seen other women pass around and giggle over, talked about land acreage and livestock numbers, and the gentleman's steady Christian character in his comfortable house. They promised something. This one promised nothing except hard work and honesty. She wrote back the same night. She did not tell him she was 31. She did not tell him that her husband Thomas had been dead for 2 years, or that the farm they'd shared in eastern Kansas had gone to the bank 8 months after the funeral when she couldn't manage the debt on a store clerk's wages, or that she had been sleeping in a rented room the size of a pantry for 14 months because she couldn't bring herself to go back to her sister's house in Missouri and listen to polite questions about when she planned to move forward with her life. She told him she could work. She told him she was not afraid of difficult ground. She told him she would need to know what the ranch actually needed before she could promise anything about the other part, the marriage part, but that she was willing to come and assess the situation honestly. She reread the letter twice and almost didn't send it because it sounded, she thought, slightly insane. She sent it anyway. His reply came in 11 days. 3 sentences. Fair enough. Train to Millhaven, ask at the depot for directions to Dry Fork Road. I'll have someone meet you. She quit the dry goods job on a Friday. She left Harlan on a Monday morning with the cracked leather suitcase her mother had given her when she married Thomas, a canvas bag of practical things. Good gloves, a decent knife, seeds she'd taken from the store's inventory and paid for out of her last wages because she didn't know what kind of kitchen garden the ranch had. And that folded advertisement, the ink-smudged one, tucked inside her coat pocket like a document she might need to prove she hadn't imagined all of this. The train ride to Montana took 2 days and felt like traveling to a different country. Millhaven was smaller than she expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected much. A depot, a main street with a general store and a feed merchant, and a saloon that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never quite finished. A church with a bell that someone had attempted to hang crooked and apparently given up on straightening. 3 or 4 streets of modest houses behind the commercial strip. Then open land in every direction, brown and gold and vast in a way that made her chest feel both tight and strangely open at the same time. She was the only passenger who got off at Millhaven. The platform was empty except for the station master, a heavy-set man in his 60s who was moving a dolly of mail sacks without apparent urgency, and a boy of maybe 15 leaning against a post with his hat pulled low, looking at her with the particular expression of someone who had been sent to do an errand they did not consider worth their time. "You the woman coming for Brennan's place?" the boy said. "Margaret Hale," she said. "Yes." The boy looked at her suitcase, then at her canvas bag, then at her, as if taking inventory. He had a lean, angular face that would probably be handsome in a few years when it finished deciding what shape it was going to be. "I'm Denny," he said. "Elias sent me. He said to tell you it's about 9 miles out and the road gets rough past the third creek crossing, so hold on if you're not used to wagon travel." "I'm used to wagon travel." Denny seemed mildly surprised by this. "All right then." The road was, in fact, rough past the third creek crossing. Margaret held on without complaint and looked at the landscape. The land out here had a particular quality to it in October. The grass gone to straw color, the hills rolling and open, the sky so enormous and so deeply blue above the brown earth that it almost didn't look real, like a painting executed by someone with access to good pigments but limited experience with proportion. She noticed the creek when they crossed it. The water was low. Not dramatically low, just low in a way that felt like a symptom rather than a season. She noticed the fence line when they passed it. One of the posts was leaning at an angle that suggested it had been that way for months, and nobody had gotten around to resetting it. She noticed all of these things without saying anything about them, because she had learned a long time ago that the first day was for watching and not for talking. "What's the herd at?" she asked Denny. He glanced at her sideways. "About 200 head, give or take. Was closer to 350 in summer. Lost some to the dry spell in August. Lost some to, well, Elias says there's a sickness goes through the calves sometimes when the water quality's off." "What kind of sickness?" "I don't know the name of it. They get loose, and then they weaken, and then mostly they die." He said it flatly, the way you said things when you'd watched them happen enough times that the shock had worn off and only the fact remained. "Brennan lost about 40 calves this past summer." 40 calves. She did the math in her head and didn't like the answer. "How long has the water been an issue?" Denny shrugged one shoulder. "Far as I know, always. Or, not always, but a long time. Elias says it used to be different." She filed that away. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and Margaret's first honest thought, the one she would never say out loud to anyone who lived there, was, "It looks tired. Not ruined. Not gone. Just tired. In the way of a thing that has been working very hard for a long time without enough support." The main house was a solid 2-story structure of weathered wood that had once been painted white and now was the color of old cream, the paint peeling in long strips along the south-facing walls, where the sun hit hardest. The barn was larger and in slightly better shape, which told her something about what the previous owners had prioritized. There were 3 outbuildings of various sizes, a corral with a section of rail that had been repaired with wire instead of wood, and a kitchen garden plot to the east of the house that had been cleared but not planted with anything for what looked like at least one full growing season. She looked at the empty garden plot for a moment longer than she looked at anything else. A man came out of the barn. She had not formed a clear picture of what Colt Brennan would look like. The advertisement had given her nothing to work with except the impression of someone blunt and practical. What came walking toward the wagon was a man somewhere in his mid-30s, tall and broad through the shoulders, in the way of someone who had done physical labor their entire adult life rather than pursuing it for any other purpose. He had dark hair going gray at the temples in an early, disorganized way, 3 days of stubble, and the kind of face that had started out probably decent-looking and gotten complicated by weather and worry. He was wearing a canvas work coat that had a tear along the left sleeve that had been stitched up badly with what looked like baling twine. He looked at her with dark eyes that were measuring and tired at the same time. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mrs. Hale," she said, not correcting him precisely, just being accurate. Something shifted slightly in his expression. "Right. I knew that. Sorry." He reached up and helped her down from the wagon without making a production of it, then stepped back immediately, keeping distance. "I'm Brennan. I'd say welcome, but I don't want to oversell what you're walking into. Your advertisement already managed my expectations fairly well." He almost smiled. It moved across his face and was gone. "Glad something in this operation is doing its job." Denny drove the wagon toward the barn. Colt Brennan stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her with that same tired measuring quality. "You want to see the house first or the operation?" "The operation," she said. He nodded, and she could tell that answer had mattered to him in some way, though he didn't say so. He showed her everything. That was the thing she noticed. He didn't hide anything, didn't steer her past the worst of it toward the parts that might impress her. He walked her through the barn, where 18 head of cattle were currently housed with a respiratory issue that had started 4 days ago, showed her the feed stores, which were lower than they should have been for October with winter coming, showed her the pasture land to the north and west, where the grass had failed to recover from the summer drought in the way it should have. "It came back," he said, gesturing at the hillside where the grass was growing in pale and thin and uneven. "Just not the way it should." "What's the soil like here?" "I don't know how to answer that technically. It grows things when we get rain. When we don't, it doesn't." "Who owns the water rights to the creek that runs through the south pasture?" He looked at her with a slight frown. "I do. It's on the property. Why?" "Because the water table is low and the soil looks like it's been running dry for years, not just since this summer. That's not a drought problem. Droughts end. What I'm looking at," she chose her words carefully, "looks like a drainage issue, like water that should be reaching the south pasture isn't reaching it." Colt was quiet for a moment. "The south pasture gets water from the creek." "How much is the creek running compared to 5 years ago?" He opened his mouth and then closed it. "I don't know exactly. Less." "A lot less?" He looked away at the hillside. "Yeah, a lot less." An older man was sitting on an overturned bucket outside the largest outbuilding, mending a piece of harness with the particular focused patience of someone who has done that specific task so many times that his hands could do it without his full attention. He was somewhere in his 60s, compact and weathered, with a white beard trimmed short, and the kind of posture that suggested a back that had been badly hurt at some point and had healed imperfectly. "Elias Boone," Colt said. "He's been running this operation longer than I have." Elias looked up at her with very steady brown eyes. "Mrs. Hale." "Mr. Boone. Denny said you were asking questions about the water before you even got off the wagon." "I noticed the creek on the way in." "What'd you notice?" "It's running low, and the way the ground looks in the south pasture, the water's been insufficient for longer than one season." Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at Colt, and something passed between them that she couldn't quite read. Then he looked back at her. "She's not wrong," he said. To Colt, not to her. Then to her, "There used to be a spring, up past the North Ridge, back in the ravine behind the abandoned quarter section, fed the whole Upper Creek system. Brennan Sr., Colt's father, said it was running strong when he first took the property 40 years ago. What happened to it?" "Slow," Elias said. "The way bad things usually happen. Sediment built up over years in the channel that connected it to the main creek. A slide blocked part of the ravine access in, 87, 88? He tried to clear it once, but it was a 2-week job and they were short-handed and it kept getting pushed back." He turned the harness piece over in his hands. "Then Brennan Sr. got sick, and then he died, and then the ranch had other problems, and nobody ever went back to it." Margaret looked at the land stretching north toward the ridge. "Is it still there? The spring?" "Don't know," Elias said. Haven't been up that ravine in 12 years. "But you think it might be?" He considered that the way he considered everything, with a kind of slow thoroughness. "I think springs don't just disappear. I think they get blocked." He paused. "I also think that ravine is a full day's hard ride up and back, and if you went up there and found nothing, you'd have wasted a day we can't afford to waste." "And if it's there?" "Then everything changes," he said simply. The house was better than the outside suggested and worse than it should have been. The kitchen was functional, but bare in a particular way that spoke of a man living alone for a long time. Not dirty exactly, but stripped of any small comfort, as if comfort had been the first thing to go when things got hard, and nobody had thought to bring it back. There was a large iron stove, a good one, well maintained. A scarred wooden table with 4 chairs, one of which had a leg that someone had repaired with wire in the same improvisational spirit as the corral fence. A window above the wash basin that looked west toward the hills and caught the late afternoon light in a way that was, despite everything, beautiful. There was a second bedroom upstairs. Colt showed it to her without ceremony. "It was my parents' room," he said. "I've been in the smaller one since they passed. The mattress is decent. There's a window that sticks in cold weather. You have to lift and push at the same time." He paused. I want to be clear that I'm not expecting that the advertisement wasn't. I understood what the advertisement was, Margaret said, and what it wasn't. He nodded, visibly relieved in a way he was trying not to show. All right. About the other part of it, she said carefully. The marriage. I'd like to get through the winter first. See what the ranch actually needs and whether I can contribute to what it needs. Then we can talk about the rest. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's reasonable. Are you sure? Because most men would find it less than Mrs. Hale. He looked at her directly. I put that advertisement in a newspaper because I needed someone who could actually help this place survive. If I wanted someone who'd just agree to everything right away without thinking about it, I'd have asked for that. He shifted his weight. I'd rather you be honest about the arrangement than comfortable. She looked at him for a moment. All right then. All right. They stood in the doorway of the bedroom with the late afternoon light coming through the sticky window, and the whole enormous question of what they were to each other hanging unresolved in the air between them, and both of them, apparently, found that preferable to false certainty. She did not sleep easily that first night. Not because the mattress was bad, it was, as he'd said, decent, but because the silence was the particular silence of a place that was holding its breath, and she was too aware of the strangeness of being somewhere new after 14 months of the same rented room with its thin walls, and the sound of the hardware store owner coming in at 10 every night and setting his boots down on the floor above her. She lay in the dark and made a list in her head of what she'd seen. The soil composition in the south pasture, the low creek water, the underperforming grass recovery, the sick cattle in the barn, the empty garden plot, the feed stores that were going to be a problem by January if they didn't supplement, the fence post that needed resetting, the split in the barn's north wall that was going to let cold air in. The harness Elias was mending that had been mended at least twice before in the same place, which meant either they needed a new harness or whatever was stressing it needed to change. And the spring, the possibly there, possibly buried, possibly still running spring up in the ravine past the North Ridge. She thought about that the longest. Springs, as she understood them, were fed by underground water that found pressure and rose. They didn't stop existing because something blocked their surface outlet. They found other ways out, or they built up pressure, or they just sat there underground waiting for someone to open the channel again, or they dried up. She didn't know enough yet to know which this one had done. She didn't know enough about a lot of things, but she had always found that the fastest way to know more was to go look, and the fastest way to understand a problem was to put your hands in it. She fell asleep thinking about the ravine. She was up before anyone else. Old habit from the farm, from the years with Thomas when there were always things to do in the hour before the day officially started. Bread to start, eggs to collect, water to bring in. She'd half expected to lose that habit in Harlan, where there was nothing much that needed doing before 8 in the morning, but it had stayed with her, stubborn as most of her instincts. She found the kitchen and got the stove going. The kindling was where sensible people kept it, in the box beside the stove, which told her that Colt Brennan was at least organized in his chaos, and found eggs and salt pork and set about making something that resembled breakfast. Elias came in at 6:15, looked at the stove with an expression of mild surprise, and sat down at the table without being asked. "How long have you been awake?" he said. "About an hour." "How long have you been up working?" "About an hour." He looked at the eggs and the salt pork beginning to crisp in the pan. "Brennan doesn't eat much breakfast." "Then he doesn't have to eat much of this." Elias was quiet for a moment, then, "He won't say so, but this place has been going at about half speed since his father died and his wife left. I don't say that to make you feel sorry for him. I say it so you understand that what you saw yesterday is not what this ranch used to be, and possibly not what it has to be." She turned from the stove. "His wife left?" 3 years ago, before the water got as bad. She said she couldn't live out here with no social life and no money and no prospect of either changing. She wasn't wrong about the facts of it. She was maybe wrong about whether facts are the whole story. He picked up his coffee mug, which she'd filled without thinking about it, and held it in both hands. He blamed himself. Men like him always do. Men like him. Men who think if they'd just worked harder or been smarter or made different decisions, other people's choices wouldn't have been what they were. He took a drink of coffee. "He's a good man, Mrs. Hale. He's just been running on empty for a while." Margaret turned back to the pan. The spring up in the ravine, she said. What do you actually think? Honestly. There was a pause behind her. I think it's there, Elias said finally. I think the channel's blocked, but the spring itself, I think it's still there. I've thought so for years. Another pause. I've also thought for years that clearing it would take 2 weeks of work, and we haven't had 2 weeks of spare labor in 6 years. What if I went up to look first, just to see if it's worth the effort? It's a day's ride. I've ridden for a day before. She heard him set down his coffee mug. You'd want to take someone who knows the ridge, and you'd want to go soon before the first hard freeze makes the upper ground too solid to read properly. How soon? Week, maybe. If you can get Brennan to agree to it. Does he take much convincing? Elias made a sound that might have been a laugh. He takes a certain amount of evidence, he said. He's not a stubborn man exactly. He just needs to know the difference between a hope and a plan before he'll back it. Fair enough. Colt came down the stairs at 6:45, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at the table where plates were already laid out. He didn't say anything for a moment. I hope you didn't, he started. I was already awake, she said. Sit down. He sat down. The first week had a rhythm to it that she fell into not because it was comfortable, but because it was necessary. She was up before 6. She worked in whatever direction needed working. The kitchen garden plot, which she cleared and turned and amended with ash from the stove and what compost she could find, knowing it was almost certainly too late in the season for much of anything but planting garlic. For spring was still worth doing. She helped in the barn when Elias was short-handed, which was most mornings, cleaning stalls and checking on the sick cattle and making notes about what she observed. She mended things. She cooked in the evenings, not because she felt it was her particular role, but because she was already in the kitchen and it seemed wasteful not to. Colt worked long hours and said little at meals, not in an unfriendly way, but in the way of a man who had gotten used to silence over dinner and didn't quite know how to unlearn it. She didn't try to force conversation. She made the meals good when she could. She noticed that he ate more when the food was better, which told her something about how he'd been eating before she arrived. On the 4th evening, he stopped in the kitchen after clearing his plate and said, You mentioned the water when we were looking at the south pasture. I did. What specifically were you seeing that I wasn't? She told him. She told him about the soil compaction patterns, the way the grass was growing thin at the roots rather than surface scorched, which suggested insufficient deep moisture rather than surface drought. She told him about the creek flow and what a significant reduction over 5 years usually indicated about upstream changes. She told him what Elias had told her about the spring, and she told him what she'd thought about it in the night since. He listened with his forearms on the table and his hands loosely clasped, and a look on his face that was entirely focused. Elias mentioned that spring years ago, he said, before the worst of it. I had other things that seemed more urgent. He paused. Every year it feels like there's something more urgent. That's usually how it goes with the foundational problems, she said. The urgent things pile up in front of them. You think it's still running? I think it might be. I'd like to go up and see. He was quiet for a moment. It's a hard ride, the upper ravine. It's not maintained. You'd be scrambling through 10 years of overgrowth. I understand that. I'm not saying you can't manage it, he said quickly. I'm saying it's genuinely difficult terrain. I know. She met his eyes across the table. But I'd like to go. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, with the manner of a man deciding to trust something he wasn't entirely sure about. Give it another week, he said. Let me shore up what's most urgent here, and I'll take you up myself. The week shaped her. Or rather, it revealed things about the shape she already had. She was not, she discovered, going to be soft about what needed doing. Elias watched her rewire a section of fence in the morning cold, and at the end of it said, You've done this before, in a tone that was somewhere between a statement and a question. Thomas ran cattle, she said, 100 head at most, but it was real operation. She didn't talk about Thomas often. She'd learned that other people's grief made most people uncomfortable, and she didn't want to be the subject of other people's discomfort. But Elias had the quality of someone who could receive information without making it a performance. He died of a fever 2 years ago, the kind that goes fast. Elias nodded. Fast is hard in its own way. All the ways are hard, she said. Yeah. He tested the new wire with a gloved hand. That's true. There was a ranch about 4 miles east called the Dillard Place, run by a man named George Dillard, who came by on the second Thursday after Margaret arrived, ostensibly to discuss a fence line boundary, but obviously, she quickly understood, to take stock of the situation. He was a big man with a confident manner and the kind of easy smile that had probably opened a lot of doors for him. He shook Colt's hand, nodded at Elias, and looked at Margaret with a kind of polite skepticism that he was doing a poor job of concealing. "Heard you'd hired help," he said to Colt after the greetings. "Hired in other arrangements," Colt said. He didn't elaborate. Quite a gamble bringing someone in from outside. George Dillard glanced at her again, and she had the distinct impression he was not talking about her in a way that was entirely about practical labor. "Man in your position might consider simpler solutions. I've told you before, Brennan, if the debt becomes—" "I'm managing the debt," Colt said. His voice had changed. Not louder, just harder, the way certain materials got when they got cold. "Well?" George Dillard smiled again with the smooth ease of a man who knew he held the stronger hand and was in no rush to play it. "The offer stands. The property has good bones. If it comes to it, I'd give you a fair price." He left half an hour later, having concluded whatever fence line conversation had been his actual purpose. And Colt stood in the yard watching the wagon go down the road with an expression that Margaret recognized. She'd worn it herself. It was the expression of a person watching someone count them out while they were still standing. "He wants the land," she said. "He's wanted it for 15 years. Colt turned from the road. "His property runs east and south. Mine sits in between him and the best water access in the county, or what used to be the best water access." He paused. "He knows the ranch is struggling. He's been patient about it." "Patient people aren't usually being kind," Margaret said. Colt looked at her. "No," he agreed. "They're usually just calculating." She'd been on the ranch 11 days when the first snow came. Just a light one, barely an inch, the kind of early October snow that was more of a warning than anything else. This is what's coming. Begin preparing. But it was enough to kill the small amount of green that had been clinging to the south pasture and to make the thin grass look even more desolate than it had the week before. She stood at the kitchen window in the morning and looked at it and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was something close to urgency. Not panic. She'd moved past panic a while back, had found that panic was too expensive a response to circumstances that required sustained action over time. But urgency, the specific tightening awareness that the calendar was moving and certain windows were closing, that she still felt. Colt came into the kitchen behind her. "Spring's moving up," she said without turning. "We should go this week." He poured coffee. "Weather might turn." "It might." She turned from the window. "But if the spring is there and accessible, I'd rather know before the ground hardens. And if it's there and cleared before winter, the lower pasture would get water through winter. If we could open the channel." She didn't know for certain they could. She didn't know for certain the spring was there. But she'd learned that if you waited for certainty before doing anything, you waited forever. 3 days? Maybe 4? If it's there. Colt set down his coffee mug, looked at the snow through the window, then at her. He had a quality she'd noticed in the first days that she was still working out how to name, not stubbornness, not inflexibility, but a kind of deep-set resistance to being pushed into optimism before the facts warranted it, as if hope was a resource he'd run low on and couldn't afford to spend carelessly. "If it's there," he said. "If." "I know. If." She held his gaze. "But if is worth investigating." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a thin wind moved the snow off the fence post and scattered it. "All right," he said finally. "We go Saturday." She nodded, turned back to the window. The south pasture was white and thin and still, but she looked past it up toward the ridge where the ravine disappeared into rock and old growth, and she felt the particular quality of attention that came when she was convinced, not certain, but convinced, that something was there. She had been wrong before. Wrong about Thomas's fever breaking, wrong about the bank giving her more time, wrong about half a dozen things she'd been convinced of. But she had learned, through all of it, that conviction wasn't a guarantee. It was just a direction, and sometimes a direction was the most useful thing you had. On Friday evening, the night before they were to ride up to the ravine, Margaret sat at the kitchen table after dinner with a piece of paper and worked through the numbers as she knew them. feed stores versus projected winter consumption, current herd size, calf losses from the summer, debt service. Colt had mentioned obliquely once, enough to give her a rough figure to work with. The timeline before the spring water, if they could restore it, would begin to affect the pasture land enough to matter to next year's grazing. The numbers were not good. They were not catastrophic, not yet, but they were narrowing. The window in which action could make a real difference was smaller than anyone was saying out loud. Elias came in from outside, stomped snow off his boots, and saw her at the table. "Working out the math?" he said. "Working out the math." He sat down across from her, and she pushed the paper toward him. He looked at it for a moment, his reading glasses in his shirt pocket, which he put on without any particular self-consciousness. "You're estimating the debt high," he said. "I didn't want to be surprised." "Fair." He looked at the bottom line, didn't change expression. "We've got one good winter left in the operation by this math. Maybe two if we cut expenses and the herd doesn't lose more." He set the paper back. "You already knew that. I wanted to make sure I wasn't wrong." He looked at her over the tops of his reading glasses. "You're not wrong." They sat with that for a moment. The stove ticked in the silence. "He knows, doesn't he?" she said. "He knows," Elias said. "He's known for 2 years. He just doesn't— Men like him don't always know what to do when the thing they've devoted their whole life to is telling them it might be done. They just keep working. It's the only response they have." He folded his glasses back into his pocket. "That's not a criticism. It's just how it is." "What was he like before?" she asked. "Before it got this bad?" Elias considered this. Harder to surprise. More, lighter, I suppose. He used to laugh more. He used to have opinions about things that weren't the ranch. He paused. He was good with the cattle, patient. He'd sit up all night with a sick animal without complaining about it. He's still good with them, but now everything feels like every loss costs him something he can't get back. Because he feels responsible. He feels like he inherited a thing and couldn't hold it. Elias was quiet for a moment. His father built this place from 40 acres in bad timing. Colt grew up believing the land was something you were supposed to steward well and pass on. Every calf he loses, every acre of grass that doesn't come back, he takes it personally. "It's not personal," Margaret said. "It's structural. The water problem has been building for 30 years. I know that and you know that," Elias said. "He knows it too in his head, but knowing something in your head and knowing it in your gut are different things. And his gut has been telling him for 3 years that he's failing." She looked at the numbers on the paper. Then she looked at the window, at the dark beyond the glass, at the direction of the ridge, even though she couldn't see it. "Then we need to find that spring," she said. "Not just for the water." Elias looked at her. "No," he said quietly. "Not just for the water." Colt came in at 9 from the last barn check and found them both still at the table. He looked at the paper and the calculations and the expression on Margaret's face and didn't ask what they'd been talking about, which was, she thought, either good instinct or bone-deep tiredness. He poured coffee, stood at the stove for a moment. "We're leaving at first light," he said. "I know," Margaret said. He looked at her from across the kitchen, and there was something in his face, not the measuring quality of the first day, something different, something that she recognized in herself as the feeling that came when you'd made a decision that was either very right or very wrong, and there was only one way to find out which. "You really think it's there?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I really think it's there," she said. He nodded once, finished his coffee, set down the mug. "Then we'll find out," he said. He went upstairs. She heard his boots on the floor above, heard the quiet of him settling in, and then the house was still again. She stayed at the table for another few minutes. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, moving through the fence posts and the dried-out grass of the south pasture with a sound like something whispering about what was coming. The first real winter was coming, the debt was coming, the decisions were coming. She folded the paper with the numbers on it and put it in her pocket. Tomorrow they would ride up to the ravine above the North Ridge, and they would find out whether the spring was there or whether it was just a story told by old men about water that used to run. She had been wrong before, but she had also been right. She turned down the lamp and went upstairs to the room with the sticky window and lay in the dark and listened to the Montana wind work its way through every gap it could find in the old white-painted house, And she thought about water, how it found its way through everything, given time and pressure, and how sometimes all a blocked spring needed was someone willing to go up and look. She slept. Outside, the snow settled on the dead grass of the south pasture, thin and cold and patient, waiting for what came next. They left before the sun was fully up, which meant they left in the kind of dark that was more blue than black, the eastern sky barely distinguishable from the land beneath it. Margaret had been awake for an hour already. She'd heard Colt moving around downstairs at 5, heard the stove being stoked, and had dressed quickly in the cold of the upstairs room, pulling on her heaviest wool shirt and the canvas work pants she'd bought in Harlan specifically because they were built for labor and not for looking like a woman who was doing labor. Elias had packed saddlebags the night before. He wasn't coming. Someone had to stay with the sick cattle in the barn, and Denny was 15 and good-hearted, but not experienced enough to manage a respiratory crisis in a barn full of stressed animals on his own. Elias stood in the yard in the pre-dawn cold and handed up the bags and then stood back with his hands in his coat pockets. "The ravine mouth is behind the second pine break past the old fence line," he said. "You'll know it by the way the ground changes. The rock comes up through the soil and the trees get crowded together. You want to follow the left wall of the ravine, not the right. The right side had a slide, the slide that blocked the channel, and the footing is bad." Colt nodded. He'd heard this before, but he listened like he hadn't, which Margaret thought said something reasonable about him. "How will we know if we find the spring?" she asked. Elias looked at her. "The ground will be different. Even with the outlet blocked, there'll be moisture in the rock, maybe some growth that doesn't match the surrounding vegetation. And if it's really there and still pressurized," he paused, "you'll feel it before you see it. The ground goes soft. Sometimes you can hear it." "Hear it?" "Water moving through a rock has a sound. Quiet, but there." He looked up at the sky, which was beginning to separate itself from the land in a thin gray line along the east. "Don't push the horses past the ravine. The upper terrain isn't worth the risk to their legs." They rode out of the yard in the thin blue pre-dawn, and Margaret followed Colt along the fence line north, and for the first mile neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying yet. The morning had its own quality of silence out here, different from the silence of the house, bigger and less personal, and she found that she didn't mind it the way she sometimes minded silence with people. It was just the land being quiet before the day started. The North Ridge came into view gradually, the way things did out here where there were no sharp interruptions to perspective. It rose from the rolling grassland in a long, broken line, the pine breaks dark against the pale sky, the rock faces catching the first gray light. It was, objectively, not a comfortable-looking piece of terrain. It was the kind of ridge that communicated, in the language of landscape, that it did not particularly care whether you came up it or not. "How many times have you been up here?" she asked. "Twice," Colt said. "Once when I was about 12 with my father. Once a few years back when I was checking the fence line and got turned around in the weather." He was quiet for a moment. "My father knew every inch of this property. I've been learning it by error." "That's how most people learn things." "Maybe." He shifted in the saddle. "He used to talk about the spring when I was young. He said it was the original reason his father, my grandfather, chose this particular section. Said there was enough water up here to feed 3 ranches, if it was managed right." A pause. "I thought he was being sentimental. Old men talk up what they've lost. Or they actually remember what it was like." He glanced at her sideways. "Yeah, or that." They reached the old fence line around 8 in the morning, the fence Elias had described, the one that marked the boundary of the abandoned quarter section, its posts gray and splitting, 2 of the 3 remaining wires sagging to the ground. Colt dismounted to lift the wire enough for them to pass the horses through without catching, and Margaret saw in that small practiced gesture something she recognized. The 1,000 small physical negotiations that made up a life spent working land. Past the fence, the ground changed as Elias had said it would. The grass thinned and the soil gave way to pale rock pushing up through the surface in irregular shelves, and the trees, mostly pine and some aspen losing their last gold leaves, crowded in closer to the draw on either side. The ravine mouth appeared around a bend, a narrowing between 2 rock walls that was half overgrown with brush, the kind of brush that grew specifically in places where water had once been and where the soil held something of that memory even decades later. "That's it," Colt said. He stopped his horse and looked at it for a moment. Margaret stopped beside him. She looked at the brush, the specific quality of green in it, still holding color even in October, even at this elevation. "The vegetation's different here," she said. "That's not just fall growth." "No," he agreed. And then quietly, as if he was admitting something he hadn't let himself believe before he saw it, "No, it isn't." They tied the horses to a pine at the ravine mouth and went in on foot. The left wall was better footing, as Elias had said. Flattish shelves of rock with enough surface to step on, though in places they had to move carefully, and in one section, Margaret had to use her hands on the rock face to keep her balance. Colt went first in most of it, not because she needed him to, but because he knew the general territory and the light was still uncertain in the shadows of the ravine. In the narrow places, he reached back without ceremony, and she took his hand for balance and then let it go when the footing improved, and neither of them made anything of it, which was the right call. The ravine was maybe 40 yards long before it opened into a wider space, a kind of natural bowl in the rock where the walls spread apart and the ceiling of branches overhead thinned enough to let actual morning light down. And here the ground changed again, dramatically enough that Margaret stopped walking and just stood still for a moment. The rock was darker. Not wet exactly, but the color rock gets when moisture is close to the surface. A deep charcoal gray compared to the pale limestone they'd been stepping on. And growing in the cracks and along the base of the far wall were plants that had no business being this far up in October. Some kind of small fern, still green, and a low moss that was vivid and almost violent in its color against the surrounding gray and brown. She crouched and pressed her hand flat against the rock of the far wall. She felt it. Not water, not exactly, but a coolness that was distinct from the ambient cold, a specific emanation from inside the rock that had a different quality than surface chill. And under her hand, very faint, like a pulse felt through stone, something. "Come here," she said. Colt crouched beside her and put his hand on the wall. She watched his face. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he took his hand away and looked at it, then at the wall, then at her. "Is that—" "It's moving," she said. "Inside the rock. The pressure's still there." She stood and looked at the wall more carefully, tracing the line of the fern growth, the moss. "The outlet is blocked. Probably up here somewhere, where the slide material came down." She looked at the debris pile at the far right of the bowl, a slumped mass of rock and old soil and dead organic material that had compacted over years into something almost geological in its density. "That's the blockage. The water's been sitting behind it, finding small exits, losing pressure gradually. But the source hasn't dried up." Colt stood beside her and looked at the debris pile. It was substantial, the kind of thing that, when you looked at it honestly, made you recalculate how long 2 weeks of work might actually take. "That's a lot of material," he said. "It is. You're thinking we can clear it. I'm thinking it's worth trying." She turned to look at him directly. "I won't tell you it'll be easy or that I know for certain what's behind it. But the spring is there, Colt. The water's there. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's just been sitting here blocked for 15 years while your pasture land dried out below it." He looked at the debris pile for a long moment. She could see him doing the calculations. The labor, the time, the risk of putting effort into this instead of into the dozen other crises waiting at the bottom of the ridge. If we clear it, and it doesn't flow the way we need it to, then we've spent 2 weeks on work that doesn't solve the problem, and we're in the same position we're in now, she said. But if we clear it, and it does flow, the south pasture gets water through winter. Not immediately. It'll take time to cut a new channel or reopen whatever channel used to run from here. But by spring, by the time the calving season starts, you'd have water moving through the lower ground. You'd have grass recovery. You'd have healthier calves. She paused. You'd have a different situation than the one you have now. He looked at her with that dark, tired, measuring quality. But underneath the tiredness, she saw something else. Something that had been very carefully controlled and was being allowed, just barely, to surface. "My father kept saying he'd get back up here," he said. "Every year. I heard it my whole childhood. He'd get back up here and sort out that spring and everything would be better. He didn't have enough hands. He didn't have enough of a lot of things." A pause. "Neither do I." No, but you have enough to try. The silence in the ravine was the particular silence of enclosed rock and close trees, denser than the open land below, with its own interior sound, which was, she realized, the faint persistent murmur of water moving through stone. He heard it too. She saw the moment he heard it, the slight turn of his head, the quality of his attention shifting. I hear it, he said quietly. I know. They stood there in the rock bowl, with the moss vivid and green on the dark wall, and the sound of buried water moving patiently through 15 years of obstruction, and she thought about how long certain things waited. Land waited. Water found its pressure and held it. You could block the outlet, pile debris on top of it, walk away and leave it for a decade and a half, and the water didn't give up or dissipate or stop being what it was. It just sat there in the dark under the rock, building the quiet pressure of something that had nowhere else to go. All right, Colt said. Not loud. More like a decision made to himself that he was letting her hear. We clear it. They spent another hour in the ravine, mapping the debris pile as best they could, probing its edges with a stick Colt found, estimating its depth and the likely direction of the original channel beneath it. Margaret made rough notes on a folded piece of paper she'd had in her coat pocket, the kind of field notes she'd learned to keep on the farm. Not precise engineering, just the observations that would matter later when they were planning the actual work. The ride back down was quieter than the ride up, but a different quality of quiet. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say to each other. The silence of two people with too many things running through their heads to spend words on any of them yet. They came out of the pine brake and onto the open ground above the south pasture, and from this elevation she could see the full scope of it. The pale, thin, winter-beaten grass, the low creek line, the ranch building small and weathered in the middle distance. From up here it looked even more tired than it did from inside it. But she could also see, with the map in her head of where the spring sat and how the terrain fell from the ravine toward the lower ground, something she hadn't been able to see from below. She could see the line of it, the natural grade that ran from the ravine floor down through the old quarter section and toward the north edge of the south pasture. The channel that had existed once, that the land still remembered in the subtle crease of its topography. Do you see that? She said and pointed. Colt followed her gesture. He was quiet for a moment. The grade. The water would run that way naturally. The channel might not even need extensive cutting, more clearing. There might be a defined bed under the overgrowth. We'd need to check the whole length. We would. But look at how it falls. She traced the line with her finger in the air. It's almost direct. Someone ran a channel there once, deliberately. You can still see the shape of it. He looked at the land for a long moment. She couldn't see his face clearly from the angle, just the set of his shoulders, which had changed since the ravine. Not relaxed exactly. She didn't think Colt Brennan relaxed often. It probably wasn't in his constitution. But something had shifted in the way he was carrying himself. The slight forward lean of a man walking into a headwind had eased, just fractionally, as if something had given him a moment of shelter he hadn't expected. My father called it the old run, he said. I thought that was just what he called it. I didn't know. I didn't understand that it was an actual constructed channel. It might be a natural one that someone improved. Hard to tell without walking the whole length. She turned to look at him. Elias would know. Elias knows everything about this land except how to fix it. He might know more about fixing it than you think, she said. He's been watching it long enough. Colt looked at her, and she saw the particular expression of a man who has been so deep inside a problem for so long that he's lost the ability to see it from outside, and who is experiencing with some discomfort the sensation of someone else providing that outside view. She knew that expression well. Thomas had worn it, in the hard years at the end when the farm was in trouble. She'd worn it herself, after, when she'd been too inside her own grief to see that she was slowly starving herself of practical options. You could have said all this when you got here, he said, instead of, building up to it. I could have, she agreed. And you'd have spent 11 days thinking I was someone who arrived with opinions before I had any facts. She kept her voice even. You needed to see me work first. I needed to understand the land first. This isn't something you can shortcut. He considered that. That's a very calculated way to approach a situation. Is it wrong? A pause. No, he said. and it sounded like it cost him something small to admit that. No, it's not wrong. They came down off the ridge in the early afternoon, the temperature dropping as clouds moved in from the northwest with the particular purposeful efficiency of weather in Montana October. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, the light had gone flat and gray and the wind had picked up enough to push dead grass flat along the fence lines. Elias was waiting in the yard. He took one look at their faces as they rode in and didn't say anything, just watched them dismount with that steady, brown-eyed patience of his. "It's there," Margaret said. He nodded slowly. "I figured if you were coming back before dark with that look, it was either there or you'd gotten hurt." "The outlet is blocked," Colt said. "Debris from the slide compacted, but the spring is still pressurized. You can hear it." Elias was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that was brief and private, the way feelings moved across faces when people had gotten good at not showing them. "Your father would be glad to know that," he said. Not maudlin, just factual. Colt unsaddled his horse without responding to that directly, but his hands slowed for just a moment on the cinch strap. That evening, after a dinner that was mostly eaten in the working silence of people thinking through problems, Elias spread out a piece of oilcloth on the kitchen table, and the three of them leaned over it with the lantern pulled close and talked through what they knew. Elias had, in the storage room at the back of the barn, a survey map of the property dating from when Colt's grandfather had purchased it. He'd retrieved it that afternoon while they were up on the ridge, and it showed, in the faded ink of someone who'd had decent surveying instincts and moderate artistic ability, both the spring and the channel he'd called the main water run in the property, notes penciled in the margins. "He built the channel," Elias said, pointing at a dotted line that ran from the north ravine mark down through what was now the overgrown quarter section and toward a notation on the south pasture edge. "It wasn't natural, or not entirely. He graded it and lined part of it with flat rock to keep it from silting up." He paused. "The lining is probably still there under the overgrowth. Stone doesn't rot." "If the lining's intact, clearing the channel is manageable," Margaret said. "The hard work is the debris blockage at the spring outlet." "How big is the pile?" Elias said. Colt and Margaret looked at each other across the table. 12 feet across at the widest point, she said. "Depth is harder to estimate. Maybe 5, 6 feet of compacted material at the center. The slide probably brought down a lot of loose rock and the organic material fell on top over the years and compressed it." Elias traced the dotted line on the survey with one finger. 2 weeks, he said. "Possibly 3. With the right tools and enough hands." "We don't have 3 weeks of spare labor," Colt said. "No," Elias agreed. "We have what we have." He looked at Margaret. "You've done excavation work before?" "I've cleared irrigation blockages. Nothing of this scale. Scale's just time." He straightened up from the map. "If we start next week, if we can get the main feed stores counted and the sick cattle stabilized before then, we might be able to put 6 full working days on the ravine before the ground gets too hard." 6 days might not be enough, Colt said. "It might not be," Elias said. "But it's what we have, and it's more than nothing. And right now, nothing is what that spring has been getting for 15 years. He said it without emphasis, just clearly, the way he said everything. "The question isn't whether 6 days is ideal. The question is whether we start." Colt looked down at the map, at the dotted line and the spring notation and the handwriting of a man who'd built this ranch from bad timing and stubborn will and had apparently, somewhere along the way, carved a water channel through half a mile of Montana hillside because he believed in what the land could do if you gave it a chance. "We start," he said. Denny had been sitting at the far end of the table, quiet, the way young people were quiet when they understood they were in the presence of an adult conversation they'd been allowed to witness but not lead. He'd been listening with the quality of attention that went beyond mere interest, the kind that stored things away. "I can dig," Denny said. The three of them looked at him. He sat up straighter. I know I'm younger, but I can dig, and I can move rock. I've been doing it since I was 12. A pause. "I'd rather be useful than not." Something crossed Elias's face that was almost affection, in the compressed way he expressed most things. "You'll be useful," he said. "You'll also be sore in places you didn't know you had." "That's fine," Denny said. Margaret looked at the boy, at his lean, uncertain face, and the deliberate steadiness he was projecting, the effort it took to sound matter-of-fact about things that clearly mattered to him. She thought about being young and needing to be taken seriously about hard things, and how rarely people offered that without requiring you to prove yourself first. You'll work with me on the channel section, she said. The approach clearing, below the slide, that's where I'll need someone who can move material consistently. She held his gaze. It's not glamorous work. I don't need it to be glamorous, Denny said. Good, she said. Neither do I. Outside, the wind had found every gap in the old walls again and was working through them with the methodical persistence of Montana weather, doing what Montana weather did. The lantern on the table threw their shadows large across the walls. The survey map with its dotted lines and faded notations lay between them, a document from another generation's effort, another man's belief that this land was worth the work it asked of you. There were two certainties that Margaret held going into the weeks ahead. The water was there, and the work would be harder than they were allowing themselves to say out loud. Both of those things were true, and neither of them canceled the other out. She folded the paper with her field notes and put it with the survey map, and thought about what it meant to decide to try. Not to succeed. You couldn't decide to succeed. Success was a result, and results had too many variables for any one person to control. But to try, to actually commit your labor and your best thinking to something with an uncertain outcome, because the alternative was standing still while things got worse. She had made that decision before, on the farm with Thomas, in Harlan, trying to hold things together alone. And every time the outcome had been what the outcome was, sometimes better than she'd feared, sometimes exactly as bad, sometimes worse. But she'd never regretted trying. What she'd regretted in the dark hours she didn't advertise to anyone were the times she'd waited too long. The times she'd let caution talk her out of action until the window had passed. The window was not closed. It was narrowing, yes. The cold coming, the feed stores counting down, the debt sitting patient and heavy as George Dillard's smile. But it was not closed. Colt rose from the table. He picked up the survey map and looked at it once more, folded it carefully along its original creases, and set it down with the kind of deliberateness that was not ceremony exactly, but was not casual either. Get some rest, he said. To all of them, but he looked at her when he said it. We've got a long run of days ahead of us. She nodded. He went upstairs. Elias dampened the lantern and the kitchen went dim with just the stove glow remaining, orange and low and warm, and the wind kept working at the walls and the distant cattle shifted in the barn, and the whole dark ranch sat on its exhausted land with the particular patience of something that had been waiting a long time to find out what it was still capable of. Margaret sat for another moment in the near dark. Her field notes, the survey map, the sound of water she'd felt through rock and heard in the closed silence of the ravine. She thought about that sound, water moving through stone, consistent, unhurried, utterly indifferent to the 15 years of sediment and debris stacked on top of it. Just there, just running, waiting for someone to open the way. She got up, banked the stove for the night, and went upstairs to the room with the sticky window. The first day in the ravine nearly broke all of them, and nobody said so out loud, which was its own kind of agreement. They'd started at 7 in the morning with 2 pickaxes, 3 shovels, a pry bar, and the combined physical capacity of 4 people who each had, for their own separate reasons, decided this particular fight was worth having. The plan was straightforward, in the way plans are always straightforward before they meet reality. Clear the approach of overgrowth and loose debris. Work inward toward the compacted center of the blockage, and see what the interior of the pile looked like once they'd gotten through the outer layers. What the outer layers looked like was 15 years of accumulated Montana hillside, dead organic material compressed into something closer to soil than debris. Rocks that had come down in the original slide and been further buried by everything that fell on top of them over the years. Root systems from the brush and scrub pine that had colonized the pile and woven through it the way plants always colonize disturbed ground, patient and thorough. Every shovelful was different, loose dirt, then sudden rock, then a mat of root fiber that required the pry bar, then more dirt with a consistency that felt like it was held together by will alone and fell apart at the wrong moment, dumping material back into the section they'd just cleared. By noon, they had moved approximately 4 feet into the pile from the approach side. Colt leaned on his pickaxe and looked at what they'd done, and then at what remained, and Margaret could see him doing the same mental calculation she was doing, which was how long this was actually going to take versus how long they'd told themselves it would take. "We need to work the edges," she said, before he could say whatever he was thinking. "Not just straight in. If we clear the sides first, the center material will have somewhere to fall when it loosens." He looked at her. "You've done this before." "I've cleared irrigation blockages. The principle is similar. This is considerably larger than an irrigation blockage." "I know what it is," she said. "Not sharp, just clear. Work the edges." He worked the edges. So did she, and Elias on the opposite wall. And Denny moving material away from the cleared sections with a wheelbarrow, they'd gotten up the ravine with considerable difficulty and some creative rope work. The pace improved slightly in the afternoon. Not dramatically, but enough. They came down off the ridge at 5:30 with the light going gray, and all four of them carrying the specific exhaustion of people who have spent 8 hours doing the kind of work that uses muscles you forget you have in the weeks when you're doing everything else. Denny was limping slightly on his right side by the time they reached the horses, though he didn't mention it and Margaret didn't draw attention to it. At dinner that first evening, nobody talked much. Elias ate with the methodical steadiness of a man fueling a machine. Denny fell asleep in his chair between the main course and the coffee and startled awake, mortified, when his fork hit the table. "Go to bed," Colt said. Not unkind. Just factual. "I'm fine," Denny said, with the automatic reflex of a 15-year-old who'd rather die than admit limitation in front of adults. "You're asleep," Elias said. "Go to bed." Denny went to bed. Margaret washed the dishes because her back hurt less when she was moving than when she was still, which was its own kind of logic, and Colt dried them with a dishcloth that had seen better years, and they stood at the wash basin in the lamplight, and she was aware of how ordinary the moment was, how completely unremarkable. 2 people cleaning up after a meal in an old kitchen with a fire going in the stove and wind at the windows. Ordinary in a way she hadn't felt in 2 years, maybe longer. The last ordinary had been Thomas, and even those last months with him had been shadowed by the money trouble and the worry. So the ordinary before that was further back than she usually let herself reach. "How bad is your back?" Colt said. She glanced at him. "I didn't say my back was bad." "You've been standing at a particular angle since we got down from the ridge." She hadn't known she was doing that. "It's fine. It'll work itself out by morning. There's a liniment in the medicine box, top shelf of the pantry. It smells terrible, but it does what it's supposed to do." "I'll find it," she said. He handed her the last dried plate. Their hands were close together for a moment, and then weren't. He hung the dishcloth over the stove rail. "We lost a calf today," he said, "while we were up there. One of the sick ones from the barn. Elias found it when he went to check. She'd been wondering when that would come up. She'd seen it in Elias's face when they came in, that particular set of his expression that meant bad news being held until the right moment. How many does that leave in the affected group? 6. 3 of them are past the worst of it, I think. The other 3... He stopped. "I don't know. I don't know if they're going to pull through." "What do you need for them?" "More than I have," he said. It came out without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. Just the honest accounting of a man who had been short of what he needed for long enough that the shortfall no longer surprised him. "There's a veterinarian in Millhaven, Harmon. He's good, but he's expensive, and I've already..." He stopped again, jaw tightening briefly. "I've already run a tab with him." Margaret dried her hands on the towel. "Write him. Tell him what you're seeing in the 3 that are struggling. He might be able to advise by letter without a visit." "He might. It's worth trying before deciding the situation's fixed." She turned to look at him. "You have a tendency to decide things are past helping before you've tried everything." He looked back at her with an expression that was not quite irritation and not quite recognition, and was probably some uncomfortable combination of both. "I have a tendency to be realistic. There's a version of realism that's just pessimism with better posture," she said. A pause. Then something crossed his face that was either offense or the beginning of amusement, and she genuinely could not tell which. "Better posture," he repeated. "Write Dr. Harmon." He wrote Dr. Harmon that night. The second day in the ravine was harder than the first in ways that were physical, but also something else. The novelty had worn off, if something this punishing could be said to have had novelty. and what remained was just the bare arithmetic of it. The pile was still mostly there. They were not. Or they were there in body, but the body was registering, loudly and without nuance, its objections to the previous day. Margaret cracked the ice in the wash basin at 5:30 in the morning and stood with her hands in the cold water for a moment before she used them. Both palms had blisters where the shovel handle had worn through her gloves. She'd taped them before bed and the tape had held, mostly. She put fresh tape over what was already there and pulled on her heaviest gloves and went downstairs. Elias was already at the stove. He had a way of existing in the kitchen in the morning that was so without drama, so fully just a person in a space, that she'd stopped being surprised by his early presence. "Back?" he said, without looking up from the pot he was stirring. "Better," she said, which was approximately true. "Hands?" She held them up briefly. He glanced at them and nodded, which was as much acknowledgement as he typically offered. "Denny's hands are going to be a problem today," he said. "He didn't say anything last night." "I know. I saw them when he was moving the wheelbarrow." She'd seen the redness at the base of his fingers, the beginning of what would be, by the end of a second day, serious blisters. "I've got extra tape." "He won't want to accept it." "He'll accept it," she said. "I'll phrase it as operationally necessary." Elias made the sound that might have been a laugh. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but she'd learned to recognize it. They were back in the ravine by 7. The cold up on the ridge was a different cold than the cold in the yard. Sharper, with the rock holding the night temperature longer than the open ground did, so that the first hour of work was done in a sustained chill that the labor only gradually overcame. Denny accepted the tape for his hands when Margaret presented it as a matter of grip efficiency without any mention of pain or accommodation. He was learning quickly, she thought, not just the physical mechanics of the work, but how to pace himself, how to read the material before he committed his full force to it, when to use the pry bar, and when to use his body weight instead. On the third day, they hit the first significant obstacle. They'd worked through the outer compacted layer and into the interior of the pile, and the interior was different from what the surface had suggested. The slide debris, the original material that had come down 15 years ago, was not the soft composite of organic matter and loose rock she'd been hoping for. It was angular limestone, some pieces the size of a man's torso, that had fallen and interlocked in the specific intractable way of things that have had 15 years to settle into each other. Colt drove the pry bar into a gap between two of the larger pieces and leaned his full weight on it, and the rock moved approximately 1 inch and stopped. He tried again, same result. "We need a longer bar," he said. "We need a different approach," Margaret said. He looked at her. She'd been studying the pile all morning, and she'd been thinking about the survey map, and about what Elias's grandfather had built, and about the direction of the original channel. "We're going straight in," she said. "We've been going straight in because that's where the blockage is densest. But we don't need to clear all of it. We need to clear enough to give the water an exit." She pointed to the left side of the debris pile, where it met the ravine wall. The original channel outlet would have been there based on the survey grade. If we work from the wall inward instead of from the front straight through, we might be able to create a channel through the slide material rather than clearing the whole mass. Elias was crouching at the edge of the pile, examining where it met the rock wall. He didn't say anything for a moment. "The wall face," he said. "There." He pointed to a section of the ravine's left wall that was, she saw now, subtly different from the surrounding limestone, darker, with a horizontal seam running through it at about knee height. That seam. That's where the water was coming out originally. The channel was cut to that seam, or the seam fed the channel, one or the other. He pressed his hand flat against the wall, over the seam, and held it there. Still cool, different from the surrounding rock. Margaret pressed her own hand beside his. The emanation was there, still, the particular coolness of stone with water behind it, the almost warmth underneath the cold that was its own kind of paradox, living water in dead rock. "If we work from here outward," she said, "clear the debris away from the wall face, work along the seam, create a path for the water to find." "It's still a lot of material," Colt said. He wasn't arguing, he was auditing. "It's less material than clearing the whole blockage," she said, "and it's targeted. If the spring has pressure, which it does, we both heard it, then once we give it an outlet, it'll do some of the work for us." He looked at the seam, at the darker rock, at her. "How confident are you?" She thought about that. She thought about Thomas's fever and the farm and the bank, and every time she'd been confident and been wrong, and what confidence was actually worth in situations where the variables outweighed the certainties by a considerable margin. I think it's the best option we have, she said. I can't tell you more than that. He picked up his pickaxe and moved to the left wall. Then let's work from the wall, he said. What followed were 3 of the hardest days of work Margaret had done since the worst of the farm years. They worked the left wall section in rotating pairs, she and Colt on the heavy rock, Elias and Denny moving material, then switching when arms gave out, then switching back. The angular limestone was brutal on tools and worse on bodies. They lost 1 pickaxe handle on the 4th morning when Colt came down on a particularly resistant piece and the wood cracked clean through at the collar. They improvised with the heavier pry bar until Elias rode down to the ranch and back with a spare handle he'd located in the implement shed, a 2-hour round trip that cost them a morning's momentum but was unavoidable. On the 5th day it rained. Not snow, rain, which was perversely worse for the work because it turned the cleared sections into mud and made the limestone faces slick and added the particular misery of being wet and cold on top of being exhausted. They worked anyway. Nobody suggested stopping. That felt important to Margaret, not because she thought stoicism was a virtue in itself, but because she understood that the moment one person named the option to quit, the option would start to take on mass and weight and become harder to refuse. Denny said almost nothing for most of the rainy day. He worked with his head down and his jaw set, and there was something in his expression that she recognized as a young person deciding what kind of person they were going to be, which was not a small thing to witness. That evening, coming down the ridge in the wet dark, Denny's horse stumbled on a loose section of trail and he grabbed the saddle horn and kept his seat. But it was a near thing, and Margaret, riding just behind him, felt her stomach drop with the specific fast fear of watching someone almost fall. "You all right?" she said. "Yeah." His voice was steady. He was working to make it steady. "That would have scared me," she said. A pause. "It scared me," he admitted. "Good," she said. "That means you're paying attention." He glanced back at her over his shoulder, and in the gray, wet, failing light she could see the gratitude on his face, which he was doing his level best to conceal. "Yes, ma'am," he said, quiet and meaning more than the words. On the evening of the 5th day, Colt received a reply from Dr. Harmon. He read it at the kitchen table after dinner, while Margaret cleared the plates and Elias mended harness, and Denny slept in his chair again, and this time nobody woke him up. He read it twice. Set it down. "What does he say?" Margaret asked. "He says the presentation I described sounds like a secondary infection on top of the original respiratory issue. Says they need clean water more than they need medicine, that the water quality is likely why the secondary infection took hold." He paused. He says the medicine he'd prescribe isn't cheap, but if the water situation improves, the 3 that are still sick have a reasonable chance. Clean water. There it was, connecting back to everything as it always did. "How long before they deteriorate further without treatment?" she asked. He says a week, maybe 10 days, before the question becomes moot one way or the other. She thought about the ravine and the wall seam and the debris they'd moved and the debris that remained. "We have a day's work left on the channel approach," she said, "maybe 2. If the wall seam gives us what I think it will." "If," he said. He'd said that word a lot in the past weeks. Not as dismissal, she'd come to understand. As honest accounting of the uncertain territory they were moving through. "If," she agreed, "but a week might be enough." He looked at the letter again, then at her. "If it doesn't work, then we figure out the medicine from somewhere else." She sat down across from him. "But the water is the foundation. Even if you solve the sick cattle right now with medicine, without better water you'll have the same problem next season and the season after." She kept her voice level. "The spring is the answer to more than the cattle." He was quiet. Outside the rain had stopped and the silence after rain had settled over the yard. That particular clean silence that comes when the world has just been washed and hasn't filled in again yet. "My wife thought this place was beyond fixing," he said. "It came out differently than most things," he said, yet not without thinking exactly, but without the usual careful routing of a man who monitored what he allowed out. "She wasn't cruel about it. She was actually quite She said it reasonably. She said she'd looked at it from every angle and she couldn't see how we come back from this. He turned the letter in his hands. I used to lie awake for a long time after she left thinking about whether she was right. Margaret didn't say anything. She'd learned that certain moments needed holding still, not filling. I still don't know if she was right, he said. About the fixed part. I know she was right that it was bad. I know she was right that there wasn't an obvious path. He set down the letter. But I've been watching you work this past 2 weeks, and I think what she couldn't see, what I couldn't see, was that there might be a non-obvious path. There might be, Margaret said. We don't know yet. No. He looked at her, and it was the most direct look he'd given her since the first day, when he'd been assessing what she was. This was different. This was something else. I know you came here for... This was a practical arrangement. You said so, and I agreed. I'm not trying to complicate that. You're not complicating it, she said carefully. I just want you to know that whatever happens with the spring, whether it works or it doesn't, the way you've approached this place has meant something to me. The way you've worked it. He stopped. He was not a man who talked about what things meant to him. She could see that, could see the effort it was costing him right now. I wanted to say that. She sat with that for a moment. The lamplight was warm. The sleeping Denny breathed steadily in his chair. Elias had gone to bed an hour ago, his boots left precisely by the door, the way he always left them. Thomas used to say that the way a person worked told you everything about them that mattered, she said. He meant it as a compliment when he said it to me. I took it as one. She paused. I've watched how you work too, how you treat the animals, how you talk to Elias and Denny, how you've been honest about the situation instead of dressing it up for me. She met his eyes. I didn't expect to respect someone I barely knew, but here we are. It was not a declaration. Neither of them was in a place for declarations. But it was true, and true things had weight, and the weight of it settled in the kitchen between them without drama, just present, the way the most real things usually arrived. The next morning was clear and cold and still, and they went back up to the ravine. The 6th day, they broke through. It didn't happen the way she'd imagined, sudden and clear and definitive. It happened the way most real things happen, which was gradually and then all at once. She and Colt were working the left wall section, which they'd cleared down to within 2 feet of the seam, and she drove the pry bar into the gap between a large angular piece and the wall face and leaned on it and felt the piece shift. Not 1 inch, not 2, but a full 6 inches to the right, and the material behind it, relieved of that anchor point, began to move with it. Stand back, she said, already moving. Colt stepped back, and the debris in that section shifted with the sound of rock grinding on rock, and a spray of loose grit and a deep collective settling, like something exhaling. And then the wall seam was exposed, fully, directly, 2 feet of dark limestone with that horizontal crack running through it clear and unobstructed for the first time in 15 years. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the seam darkened. Wet first, then wet dark, then darker still, and then a thread of water appeared at the left end of the seam, running down the wall face, thin but continuous, absolutely clear, and then widening. And then the thread became a trickle, and the trickle moved down the cleared section of the ravine floor and found the grade, found the old run channel below them, and began to move toward it. Denny said from behind them, "Oh, just that." "Oh," like a word chosen specifically because it was the only one that fit. Colt was standing completely still. His pickaxe was at his side, one hand loose on the handle, and he was watching the water run down the wall and across the cleared floor, and he had the expression of a man who has been bracing for something not to work for so long that it working was physically difficult to absorb. The trickle widened, not dramatically. This wasn't a flood, wasn't a rushing outpour, just the quiet, steady movement of water that had been blocked and was now, incrementally, finding its release. But it was consistent. It didn't stop. It ran, and it found the floor of the ravine, and it moved. Margaret stood with both hands at her sides and watched it, and felt something in her chest that she did not have a clean name for, that was made up of too many things. Relief and exhaustion, and the specific emotion of watching something that was supposed to work actually work, which was different from the emotion of things you hoped would work. Because hope was partial, and this was confirmed. It was done. It was real. She looked at Colt. He was still watching the water, Then he turned his head and looked at her, and his face was open in a way she hadn't seen it, the careful management of expression set aside. Just a man looking at something that mattered to him and letting it show. He said very quietly, "It's running." "It's running," she said. Elias, at the back of the cleared section, said nothing for a long moment. Then he crouched down and put his hand in the thin flow of water where it moved across the rock floor, and he held it there, and his shoulders rose and fell once with the particular effort of a person managing something private, and then he straightened and took his hand back and stood up and was composed again. "It'll widen as the pressure builds," he said. His voice was even, almost. "We should clear the channel below to give it somewhere to go." "We will," Margaret said. "Tomorrow." They stood in the ravine in the cold, clear morning with the water running and Denny still saying nothing, still just watching with that open-mouthed quality of someone experiencing something they know they'll remember. And the sound of the spring filled the enclosed space, thin and quiet and absolutely persistent. The sound of water that had been there the whole time, patient past any patience she could fully comprehend, waiting for someone to come and open the way. The channel work took 4 more days. The old run, as Elias's grandfather had named it on that faded survey map, had not disappeared so much as buried itself under decades of fallen leaves and blown soil and the patient encroachment of grassroots that had no interest in whether a ranching operation survived. In some sections, the stone lining was intact precisely as Elias had predicted. Flat pieces of local limestone fitted together without mortar, just carefully placed, holding their arrangement through pure geometry after 40 years, because the man who'd set them had understood that good stonework didn't need anything to hold it together except its own weight and the precision of the fitting. In other sections, the lining had shifted or been pushed aside by root systems, and those sections needed re-clearing and in 2 places relaying, which meant gathering stone from the ravine floor and fitting them the same way the original builder had. It was Elias who did the relaying. He worked the stone with the unhurried certainty of someone operating from memory rather than calculation, setting each piece and pressing it flat and testing it with his boot before moving to the next. And watching him, Margaret understood that he had seen this channel before. Not in years, maybe decades, but he had seen it when it was working, when the water ran through it clear and steady, and that memory lived in his hands. "You helped build this," she said on the second day, when she was working alongside him on the worst section. He didn't look up from the stone he was setting. "I was about Denny's age, Brennan's grandfather, the old man, Edgar. He hired my father, and my father brought me along." He pressed the stone flat. Edgar Brennan was particular about the work. He didn't like shortcuts. He'd make you pull up a stone and reset it if the angle was wrong even 1 degree. A pause. "I was furious about it at the time. I understand it now. Did you know then that it would last this long?" "I thought it'd last forever," he said. "I was 15. I thought everything good lasted forever if you built it right." He straightened and looked at the length of channel they'd cleared, the water already beginning to find its way along it in a thin silver line. "Turns out even the things you build right need tending." By the end of the 4th day, the water was moving. Not powerfully. It would be weeks before the full pressure of the spring built up enough to run the channel at volume, and months before the ground of the south pasture showed any real response to the improved moisture. But the line of water was unbroken from the ravine floor to the north edge of the lower pasture, covering the half-mile of grade that the survey map had shown and that the land had quietly remembered all along. And that felt like something. That felt like more than something. The 3 sick cattle in the barn recovered, not all at once, and not without cost. They were thin, and 2 of them had lost enough condition that they'd need careful management through the rest of winter, but they did not die. Dr. Harmon's letter had specified what to watch for in the final critical days, and Margaret had watched for it and managed accordingly, and by the 2nd week of November, all 3 were eating properly and the immediate crisis was past. Colt told her, the evening of the day the last sick animal stood up and ate a full portion without distress, that he'd been expecting to lose all 3. "I'd already counted them out," he said. "They were in the barn, both of them, the way they often found themselves in the evenings. Not because they'd arranged to be there, but because the barn had become a place of ongoing attention that drew them naturally. In my head, I'd already written them off. "You do that," she said. Not accusatory, observational. "I know I do." He was quiet for a moment. He was rubbing down the animal's neck with the absent-minded affection of someone who'd spent decades around cattle and whose hands moved to them without thought. It's easier than hoping and being wrong. It's also how you stop trying before you need to. He looked at her over the animal's back. When did you get so comfortable telling me things I don't want to hear? About the second week, she said. When I realized you'd rather hear the difficult truth than be handled. He considered that. I'm not sure I'd have said that about myself. You don't have to say it about yourself. I can say it for you. He almost smiled. The almost smile happened more now than it had in October, which she'd noticed without making anything of it. George Dillard came back on a Thursday in mid-November. He rode in without announcement, which was not unusual in ranch country where people dropped in when they were passing, but Margaret had come to read George Dillard's casual manner as a kind of performance, and this visit had the feel of timing. He had, she suspected, heard something. Word traveled in this part of Montana with the efficiency of people who had little else to pass between them, and the work they'd been doing up on the ridge, 4 people going up and coming down daily, the channel work visible from the high ground on the east side if you knew where to look, was not invisible. He came to the house and Colt met him on the porch, and Margaret watched from the kitchen window without making herself obvious about it. They talked for maybe 20 minutes. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the shapes of the conversation. Dillard's easy, expansive manner, the gestures toward the north ridge that confirmed he'd seen or heard something, the moment when Colt's posture shifted subtly in a way she'd learned to recognize as him holding a position without raising his voice about it. When Dillard rode out, Colt came inside and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter with it. He's heard about the spring, he said. I assumed. He says he's glad for us. Says it's good news for the property. He drank his coffee. He also says that if we ever want to revisit the sale conversation, the water development would add value and he'd account for that in his offer. Of course he would, Margaret said. He mentioned that the work we've done doesn't change the underlying debt situation. He's right that it doesn't. Not yet. She turned from the stove to look at him. He's not wrong about the facts. He's just wrong about what the facts mean. He thinks they mean the end is still coming. What do you think they mean? Colt set down his coffee mug. He looked out the window toward the south pasture, where the grass was brown and winter flat, but where, if you walked it now, you could feel the ground beneath your boots was different in the north sections where the channel water was beginning to reach. Slightly softer, slightly more giving. The kind of difference only someone paying close attention would notice, but it was there. I think, he said slowly, that the end was coming when she arrived. Margaret, when you arrived. He corrected himself without fuss, and she let it pass, and that it may still come, but I think there's now a version of events where it doesn't, and 2 months ago there was no such version. He paused. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not nothing. Winter came properly in the last week of November, the kind of cold that moved in and established itself as a permanent condition rather than a visit, and the ranch contracted around the work of survival the way ranches did in hard winters. The cattle needed more feed, more checking, more active management. The water in the channel froze at night and ran in the afternoons when the temperature lifted enough, which was imperfect but was still more water reaching the lower pasture than had been there in years. Elias tracked it with a particularity that was almost scientific, making daily notes on flow and temperature and the condition of the ice formation, because Elias understood that you managed what you measured. Denny had changed since the ravine work. Not dramatically. He was still 15 and still subject to the particular lurches of 15-year-old dignity. But there was something settled in him that hadn't been there before. He worked with more self-direction. He asked better questions. He'd taken it upon himself to check the channel section through the old quarter section every other morning, walking the length of it in the cold to make sure no new debris had fallen across it overnight, reporting back to Elias with a conciseness that suggested he'd paid attention to how Elias himself communicated information. Margaret watched this and found it quietly satisfying in a way that surprised her. She hadn't expected to care about the boy's development, but that was the thing about people you spent hard days alongside. You couldn't help acquiring stakes in them. One evening in December, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner while the wind worked at the north wall with serious intent, Colt brought out the ledger. She had known this was coming. He'd been moving toward it for weeks, and she'd let him move toward it in his own time, because rushing a person to their reckoning never helped the reckoning come out better. He set the ledger on the table between them and opened it to the current column, and she looked at the numbers with him. They were not good. They were better than they'd been in October. 2 fewer catastrophic loss events, the medicine costs for the sick. Cattle offset partially by the fact of 3 animals surviving that he'd counted as lost. But the debt line hadn't changed, and the interest was what it was, and the question of the spring payment in February was sitting at the bottom of the page like a stone. "I can make it to February," he said, "if nothing else goes wrong." "Things always go wrong in winter." "I know." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm not saying I expect them not to. I'm saying where I am right now." She looked at the numbers. The spring payment was to a land bank, not to Dillard, which she'd been half afraid of. And land banks, in her experience, were more interested in eventual repayment than in quick liquidation, especially on a property that was beginning to show signs of active management. "Have you talked to the bank directly?" "Not through letters. Directly. Not since last year." "You should go. Before February, not after. Show them what you've done. The spring, the channel, the pasture recovery as it's developing. Banks don't like surprises. What they hate more than debt is feeling like they're being managed at arm's length." She closed the ledger gently. "Give them the information. Let them make a decision with the whole picture." He looked at her. "You're asking me to walk into a bank and tell them I have water now. I'm asking you to walk into a bank and tell them you've made a significant capital improvement to the property that directly addresses the underlying cause of the production decline." She held his gaze. "Which is true. You make it sound like—" "I make it sound like what it is," she said. "You've been narrating this situation to yourself in the worst possible version for 2 years. The bank doesn't need that version. They need the accurate version." He was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind was doing what it did. "You'd come with me?" he said. The question had more weight to it than its 4 words suggested. He knew that. She knew that. Going to the bank together, presenting a united account of the ranch's situation and its prospects, was not a neutral act. It was the kind of thing people who had made a decision did. "I'll come with you," she said. He nodded. Once, slow, the way he committed to things. Then he picked up the ledger and closed it and set it on the shelf and came back to the table, and they finished their coffee in the way that had become their habit. The particular quiet of 2 people who had grown comfortable enough with each other that silence wasn't something to fill. It was Denny who said what nobody had said directly, and he said it on a cold Saturday morning in late December when he and Margaret were checking the channel, and he was being uncharacteristically quiet even by his own standards, which she'd learned to recognize as a sign that something was working on him. "Are you going to stay?" he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the channel, at the water moving thin and clear under a skim of ice at the edges. "On the ranch," he added, as if clarifying. "That's the plan," she said. "I mean, permanently." He said it carefully, like the word was more delicate than his voice. "Because if you left—" "I know it's not my business," he said quickly. "I know that. I just think if you left, it would be—" He stopped and was clearly unhappy with himself for starting the sentence. "Brennan's different since you came," he said. "The place is different." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "I'm not leaving," she said, not because she needed to reassure him, though she understood that she was doing that too, because it was simply accurate. She had looked at this worn, hard-used, stubbornly alive place in the weeks since the spring opened, and she had felt, without ceremony or announcement, that she had arrived somewhere. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but somewhere. Denny nodded with evident relief that he was working hard to conceal. "Okay," he said. "Okay, good." He looked back at the channel. "The flow's stronger today than yesterday." "About 15%, she agreed. "Is that good?" "It's very good," she said. He nodded again, satisfied, and they walked the rest of the channel length in the cold morning air without talking, which was its own kind of conversation, and the water ran beside them clear and steady and with increasing confidence, the way things moved when what had been holding them back was finally gone. The bank meeting happened on a Thursday in January, on a day cold enough that the air itself seemed fragile, like it might crack. She and Colt drove the wagon to Millhaven in the early morning, both of them in their best clothes, which on a working ranch was a relative distinction, but was at least an honest effort. The The bank manager was the man named Clifford Hatch, who had the professional neutrality of someone trained to express neither optimism nor pessimism and had been doing it so long that it had become his actual personality. He received them in a wood-paneled office that smelled of old paper and listened to what Colt said and what Margaret said and looked at the figures she'd prepared and said almost nothing until they were done. Then he picked up her figures and read through them again and set them down. "The spring is confirmed running?" he said. "Since November," Margaret said, "consistently and with increasing flow volume. And the channel is operational to the south pasture. The north section of the south pasture is already showing soil moisture improvement. We expect grass recovery to begin significantly in spring." Hatch looked at Colt. "You're asking for the February payment to be restructured." "I'm asking for a 6-month deferral on the principal," Colt said. He had the particular steady quality of a man who has been talked into more confidence than he started with, and is discovering that it actually functions. "With interest continuing as scheduled. By summer, if the pasture recovery proceeds the way the figures project, we'll have additional production capacity and the debt position changes." Hatch was quiet. He tapped the figures with one finger. "A deferral requires a demonstration of viable operations path," he said. 6 months ago, I couldn't have offered that on this property." 6 months ago, the spring wasn't open," Margaret said. Hatch looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to surprise that his professional neutrality allowed. Then he looked back at the figures. "I'll need to review this with the board," he said. "But," he paused with the manner of a man offering a thing he doesn't offer routinely, "I don't see a compelling reason to recommend against the deferral." Colt said nothing. His hands were flat on his knees and completely still, which she'd come to understand was what he looked like when he was feeling something he hadn't prepared for. "Thank you," Margaret said, because someone had to say something. They drove back to the ranch in the January cold with the information settling between them. Not celebration, because the deferral wasn't confirmed yet, and it wouldn't solve everything even when it was, but something adjacent to relief. The specific lightness of a weight that has been briefly lifted, even if it hasn't been removed entirely. Halfway back, Colt said, "I wouldn't have done that without you there." "You would have," she said. "Eventually. Maybe, but not in January. Not in time." She didn't argue with that. The road was hard under the wagon wheels and the sky was enormous and white with winter, and the ranch was 20 minutes ahead of them in the frozen landscape, waiting in the way it always waited, like something that understood patience from the inside out. "I was thinking about what Denny asked you," he said. She looked at him. "He told you about that?" "He's 15. He tells Elias things, and Elias tells me things." He kept his eyes on the road. "He asked if you were staying." "He did." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I wasn't leaving." Colt was quiet for a mile of frozen road. The horses moved at their steady pace, and their breath made small clouds in the cold air. "We never finished that conversation," he said. "About the other part of the arrangement." "No," she said. "We didn't." "I'd like to," he said. "When you're ready." She looked at the road ahead and at the pale winter sky and at the land they were moving through. This difficult, tired, stubborn, increasingly alive land that she had put her hands into and found worth putting her hands into. She thought about Thomas, the way she always let herself think about Thomas now, not with the closed, desperate grief of the first year or the numb grief of the second, but with the open, honest grief of someone who has accepted the shape of a loss without pretending it isn't there. She thought about what it meant to be ready. "I'm ready," she said. He looked at her then, full and direct in the way he looked at things when he'd decided to trust them. And she looked back at him without looking away, which was its own kind of answer. The wagon moved along the frozen road toward the ranch, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence was not empty. The bank's letter arrived on a Tuesday in early February, which happened to be the same day the south pasture showed its first real green. Margaret saw the green first. She was walking the north section of the south pasture in the morning, checking the soil. Full moisture the way she'd been doing every few days since November, and she almost stepped on it. A small cluster of new grass shoots pushing up through the frost-pale soil, thin and very green, the particular green of things that have been working underground for a long time before they break the surface. She crouched down and looked at it for a long moment without touching it, the way you looked at something you'd been waiting for and didn't want to disturb now that it had finally arrived. Then she stood up and went to find Colt. He was in the barn with Elias going over the morning count, and she came through the barn door and said, "Come look at something." And something in her voice made him set down his clipboard without asking questions. They walked out to the north section together, and she pointed. He stood over the small cluster of green shoots and was quiet for a long time, long enough that Elias, who had followed at his own pace, came up beside them and looked down and also said nothing. "It's not much," Colt said finally. "It's the beginning," she said. "The beginning is always not much." He crouched down the way she had, and she watched his face. And what she saw on it was not the careful managed hope of a man rationing his optimism, but something rawer and less controlled, the expression of someone who has been braced against disappointment for so long that when the thing they needed actually appears, the body doesn't know quite what to do with it. He put 2 fingers very lightly against the soil beside the shoots, not touching the plants themselves, just the ground, feeling what was there. "The water did this," he said. "The water and the work," she said. "They're not separable." Elias turned and walked back toward the barn without announcement, which was his way of giving people privacy when privacy was warranted. He was good at knowing when to leave. Colt stood up. He looked at the spread of the north section, the pale winter ground with its small, bright interruption of green, and then at the channel line running along the upper edge, and then further north toward the ridge where the ravine was hidden behind the pine brake. And his gaze moved across all of it with the quality of a man reading something he'd been struggling to read for years and had finally found the right light for. "The deferral letter came this morning," he said. "I know. I saw Denny bring the mail in." She had not opened it. She'd left it on the kitchen table and gone out to check the pasture. "What does it say?" "Approved. 6 months, interest only, principal deferred to August." He said it simply, without inflation. "It's not a solution, it's time." "Time is what you work with," she said. He looked at her. "I know." They stood in the cold February morning with the new grass between them, and she thought about what Elias had said in those early days about men who blamed themselves for other people's choices and carried it like a verdict. She thought about how hard it was to revise the story you'd been telling yourself about what you were and what you were capable of, and how the revision didn't happen in one moment, not usually, but in accumulation, day after day of evidence that the story was wrong, until the weight of the evidence finally outmasked the weight of the story. The marriage happened on a Saturday in late February, in the kitchen of the ranch house with Elias and Denny as witnesses and a justice of the peace named Aldous Webb, who drove out from Millhaven in a buckboard and performed the ceremony with the efficient warmth of a man who had done this many times and still meant it. It was not an elaborate affair. Margaret wore her best dress, which was dark green wool and decent, if not fine, and Colt wore a clean shirt and his good coat with the sleeve properly mended, and Elias had somehow produced a small bunch of dried wildflowers from somewhere and left them on the kitchen table that morning without comment. Aldous Webb asked them what he needed to ask them, and they answered what they needed to answer, and it was brief and imperfect and real, which was, Margaret thought, the best version of most important things. Denny shook Colt's hand afterward with a solemnity that was sweet and slightly painful to witness, the formal gravity of a young person who understood the weight of the moment more than he understood how to carry it naturally. "Congratulations," he said. Then to Margaret, "Both of you." "Thank you, Denny," she said. "Are you—" He stopped, started again. "Are things going to be all right now?" It was such a direct and honest question, asked with the particular vulnerability of someone who had invested enough to be genuinely afraid of the answer, that Margaret had to take a moment before responding. "Some things will be hard," she said. "The debt doesn't disappear. The land takes time. There will be seasons that are worse than others." She looked at him steadily. "But yes, I think things are going to be all right." He nodded, and the relief on his face was so unconcealed that it was almost like watching him exhale something he'd been holding since October. Spring came the way Montana springs came, not gently, not with any particular kindness, but with a kind of indifferent abundance, the sky swinging between winter and warmth on a daily basis, the ground alternating between frozen and sodden, everything happening at once and at cross purposes with everything else. The calving season started in March, and Margaret was involved in it from the first day in a way that even she hadn't fully anticipated, which was to say she hadn't expected to love it the way she found she did. The long night watches, the intervention when things went wrong, the strange, persistent miracle of new animals arriving in the world wet and confused and absolutely determined to stand up. They lost 4 calves in March. That was lower than the previous year's loss rate, but the 4 deaths were still 4 deaths, and she learned from watching Colt that the correct response was to grieve them briefly, understand what you could learn from each loss, and keep moving. He was good at that. Better than she would have guessed from the man she'd met in October, who seemed to have used up his capacity to absorb loss. But loss on a working ranch was different from the accumulated grinding losses of a failing operation she was coming to understand. Specific losses, when the overall direction was toward recovery, had a different weight than the same losses against a background of systemic collapse. 47 calves survived March and April. That was the number Elias wrote in his book, underlined without editorializing. 47. In May, George Dillard came back. She had been expecting him. He had a sense, she'd noticed, for timing, an instinct for when to appear that suggested he kept better track of neighboring operations than he ever admitted. He rode in on a Wednesday afternoon when Colt was up on the north section with Denny checking fence, which she suspected was not a coincidence. He found her in the kitchen garden, where she'd been working since 7 in the morning, the garden now properly planted and already showing rows of green, with a confidence that the neglected patch of October had not suggested was possible. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, with the smooth ease that was his default register. She looked up. "Mr. Dillard." He looked at the garden, at the house, at the south pasture visible past the fence line, which was green, genuinely, substantially green now, the recovery more advanced than even her February projections had anticipated, the grass coming back thick in the sections with the best water access. Something moved across his face that he covered quickly. She caught it anyway. It was the expression of a man who had made a calculation and discovered the calculation was wrong. "The place looks different," he said. "It is different." He nodded slowly, looking at the pasture. "I heard about the spring, the work you did up on the ridge." He paused. "I'll be honest, Mrs. Brennan, I didn't think it was possible. Most people didn't. I was going to make an offer," he said, "in February. After the winter, I thought—" He stopped. He was too self-possessed to finish that sentence honestly. "You thought the winter would finish us," she said. Not unkind, just clear. He looked at her directly, and she gave him credit for not pretending. "I thought the probability was high," he said. "I wasn't wrong about the debt situation." "No, you weren't wrong about that. But you're still here." "We're still here," she said. He looked at the pasture again for a long moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was, beneath the polished surface of him, something almost like honesty. "You're going to be fine," he said. "I can see that now." He turned his horse. "The offer's off the table for what that's worth." "I know," she said. "It was off the table in November." He rode out, and she watched him go, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel about George Dillard, which was a small compassion. Not for his intentions, those had been what they were, but for the specific loneliness of being a man who operated entirely through calculation and found himself, in the end, outmaneuvered by something that had nothing to do with calculation. Something that was just people deciding to try, and then actually trying, and then not stopping. Colt came back from the north section at noon, and she told him Dillard had come and gone. He listened and was quiet for a moment. "He say anything worth keeping?" he said. "He said the offer was off the table." "Good. He also said we were going to be fine." Colt looked at her. "You believe him?" "Not because he said it," she said. "But yes." The local newspaper ran a short item in June. She didn't know who had told them. Millhaven was small enough that information moved through it like water through good soil, finding every available path. But the item appeared on a Thursday, 4 paragraphs on the front page of the Millhaven County Register, below a story about a livestock auction and above an advertisement for the general store. It described the spring restoration without getting the technical details entirely right, called the channel work a significant engineering undertaking, which made Elias snort when Denny read it aloud at dinner, and referred to the ranch's recovery as one of the more remarkable agricultural reversals in the county's recent memory. Denny read the whole thing twice, and his pride in it was so transparent and undefended that even Colt smiled. A real one, the kind that stayed. "They spelled my name wrong," Elias said. "They spelled everyone's name wrong," Denny said. "They called Brennan Brett Brannon. They called me Elliot Boone. At least they got the first letter." Margaret folded the newspaper and kept it, not because the article was accurate, but because it was evidence, the kind of external confirmation that a thing had actually happened, that it was real enough for other people to notice and record, however imperfectly. She thought sometimes about the woman who had folded that advertisement in a brown envelope and carried it in her pocket until the ink smudged. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't known, what she'd been running from, and what she'd been, without fully understanding it yet, running toward. She didn't romanticize it. The hard truth was that she'd answered that advertisement partly because she was out of other options, that the courage in it was not unmixed with desperation, that she'd walked through Colt's Gate in October not because she'd seen the future clearly, but because standing still had become impossible. That was the thing she'd learned or relearned or learned in a deeper place than she'd learned it before. The future didn't reveal itself in advance. You couldn't see whether a thing was worth trying until you tried it. The spring could have been dry. The channel could have been collapsed beyond clearing. The cattle could have died. The bank could have refused the deferral. The grass could have failed to come back. Any of those things could have happened, and some of them still might happen in some future season because the ranch was not fixed, not permanently, not in the way that removed it from the ordinary risks of land and weather and debt and time. It was just alive again, working again, moving in the direction of something instead of away from it. She thought about what Elias had said in those first days about men who kept working because it was the only response they had, and she thought about how that wasn't entirely wrong but wasn't entirely right either, because working wasn't just a reflex, not when you did it well. Working was a form of argument. It was saying, against the evidence of the bad seasons and the low water and the shrinking herd and the neighbor who was waiting patiently for you to fail, it was saying, without words, that you weren't done yet. That the situation didn't get to have the last word, that the last word was yours, and you were still working on it. On an evening in late July, after a day that had been hot and long and full of the particular satisfaction of hard work done in good conditions, Colt and Margaret sat on the porch, not for any special occasion, just because the evening was good and the work was done and the porch was there. Colt had 2 cups of coffee that had gone mostly cold while they'd been talking about the north fence section that needed resetting before fall, and the cup sat in his hand now forgotten while he looked at the south pasture. The grass was high, not perfect. There were thin sections where the soil was still recovering, and the far eastern edge was slower than she'd hoped because the channel water hadn't fully reached it yet, and next year she wanted to extend the rock lining in the middle section where silt was beginning to accumulate. There was always the next thing to do. That was the nature of it. But the high grass, vivid in the evening light, moving slightly in the warm July air, it was real, and it was there, and 47 calves were in it, and the herd that had been at 200 head in October was at 240 now, with more expected in the fall breeding results. Elias was somewhere in the barn doing whatever Elias did in the evenings, which was some version of work and observation and the private company of his own thoughts. Denny had ridden home to his family's place 3 miles east. He came 4 days a week now, regular as the weather allowed, and had been asking Colt quiet questions about what it took to run an operation of your own someday, which Colt answered seriously without making it into more than a conversation. "What are you thinking about?" Colt said. "The eastern section," she said. "I want to extend the channel lining next spring." He looked at her sideways. "We're sitting on the porch in July." "I know where we are." "You can't turn it off, can you?" "Can you?" He thought about that. "No," he said. "I can't." "Then we're well matched," she said. He looked back at the pasture. The evening was settling into the particular golden register of midsummer Montana evenings, everything warm lit and long shadowed, the ridge to the north just beginning to go purple at its edges. "I wrote to my sister," she said, "last month. First time since I left Kansas." He turned to look at her. He knew about the sister in Missouri, about the polite questions about moving forward, about the silence Margaret had chosen as easier than explaining. "What did you say?" "I told her about the ranch, About the spring. She paused. I told her I'd found somewhere. What did she write back? I don't know yet. I sent it 3 weeks ago. She looked at the pasture. She might not write back. We weren't. It's complicated. Families are. Yeah, he said. He didn't elaborate. His own family history was a set of absences she'd come to understand without needing enumeration. The father who'd built this ranch and died. The mother before that. The wife who'd left. The long years of solitude that had shaped him into someone who'd had to be taught back toward other people slowly and at close range. She might. She might, Margaret agreed. They were quiet for a while. The light changed slowly the way it did in summer, the long, reluctant retreat of a good day. The bank payment, he said. August, she said. I know. We can make it. Between the calf weight gains and the pasture lease I worked out with Henderson, we can make it. He said it not as performance, but as confirmation, like someone reading coordinates aloud to verify a position. It's going to be close. Close is fine, she said. Close means we made it. He nodded, set down the cold coffee. She had learned something about him over these months that she thought he didn't fully know about himself, which was that he was braver than he believed he was. The thing he called realism, the careful accounting of probable failure, was not cowardice. She'd understood that early. It was what happened to a person who loved something enough to be afraid of losing it. The bravery was that he'd kept working anyway, kept showing up for the land and the animals and the people around him, even when the math said there was no good reason to expect it to matter. That kind of bravery was quiet. And it didn't look like bravery from the outside, and the person exercising it almost never recognized it in themselves. But it was real. It was the kind that lasted. What do you want? She asked. He looked at her. It was a particular kind of question, and he knew it. Not about the ranch, or the payment, or next spring's planting schedule. Right now? He said. Generally, she said. For this place. For... She gestured, a small motion that encompassed the porch and the pasture and the ranch and what they'd made of it. He thought about it, genuinely the way he thought about things, without rushing toward an answer just to have one. I want the herd at 400 by the time I'm 40, he said. I want the south pasture fully recovered. The eastern section, too, once you sort the channel lining. He paused. I want Denny to learn enough here that when he starts his own place someday, he doesn't have to learn it all the hard way. Another pause. Longer. I want what we've been doing. I want this to be what we keep doing. She looked at the pasture, at the grass moving in the warm air, at the ridge where the spring ran, where she and this man had driven pry bars into 15 years of accumulated obstruction because neither of them had been willing to accept that what was blocked was permanently closed. That's a good answer, she said. What do you want? He said. She thought about it. About the woman with the smudged advertisement and the cracked suitcase and 2 choices at a gate in October, and about how much she'd lost before that, and how much she'd found since, and about the complicated truth that loss and finding were not opposites, but things that happened in the same life, sometimes almost simultaneously, and that neither canceled the other. I want to see the eastern section green, she said. He was quiet. And I want the sister to write back, she added. And, he said, because he knew her well enough now to know when she was leaving the most important thing for last. She looked at him. At the face she'd been reading for 9 months, the complicated geography of a man who had been worn by difficulty and was, slowly and imperfectly, being restored by the same combination of water and work and time that was restoring his land. I want what we have, she said, and I want more of it. He didn't say anything. He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand and held it, not dramatically, just with the steady, unhurried pressure of someone who meant to stay. They sat like that while the last of the summer light left the pasture and the ridge went dark, and the stars started to be visible in the deep Montana sky, one at a time and then all at once. The grass was there in the dark, real and rooted and growing. The water moved in the channel in the dark, consistent and clear, running down from the spring that had been there all along, that had only ever needed someone willing to come up and open the way. Somewhere in the barn, Elias moved around in the lamplight, doing whatever needed doing, as he always had, as he would tomorrow. The porch held them. The land held the porch. The water held the land. And the 2 people on the porch held each other, imperfectly. and without any promises about what the next hard season would bring, and with everything that mattered said or unsaid between them, and the night came down on Dry Fork Ranch the way nights came down on places that had decided they were still worth something. Completely, and without apology, and full of the quiet that follows when the long work of a day is finally, honestly done.